Well, I could not be happier to be joined by Yanis Varoufakis, a former Greek finance minister who very famously stepped down in an act of principle, rarely seen this side of the pond, also author of several fantastic books. I recently read Talking to My Daughter, had a copy on the shelf for a while about the economy, how capitalism works and how it fails. Also, most recently, another now, Dispatches from an Alternative Present. Welcome, Yanis Varoufakis.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor.
So people who know me and listen to this show know how much I love Star Trek and how much I feel like it's formed my politics. Yeah. I think that growing up with Star Trek has informed my ability to imagine a better world. And I'm curious, as someone who has often invoked Star Trek in the course of your explanations about the economy and in your imaginings of a better future, how it has informed you. Specifically, I've recently heard you say that our options for the future are we are going to end up in a place that's like The Matrix, or we're going to end up in a place like Star Trek. Why do you see those as the two kind of options before us?
Technology is a given. There's nothing we can do to stop the evolution of technological change. And that is a good thing, because there's nothing better than being able to create technical devices that assist us in getting rid of chores and enhancing our prospects and possibilities as a species. But at the same time, technology is a double-edged sword. It can be used for ill as well as for good. But more than that, my understanding of capitalism is that it is a system which is fantastic at producing new technologies, and we've seen it since the Industrial Revolution to this very day with the digital wonders that are at our disposal. But nevertheless, even if you think of Charlie Chaplin's wonderful movie Modern Times, they are not exactly machines that liberate us from chores. What happens is they find new ways, the machines, of enslaving us, or we find new ways of enslaving each other using machines in order to do it. So if you think of Charlie Chaplin in that wonderful movie Modern Times, he becomes part of the machine. Instead of the machine helping him lead a better life and taking chores off his back, so to speak, in the end, he becomes part of the machine. The machine is ruling over his life. It's dictating an increasing pace of work, exploitative work, bullshit jobs, to quote my friend David Graeber, now deceased, unfortunately. So, in the end, if you take this to its logical conclusion, either we're going to become slaves of the machines. The Matrix is the best example I can think of, because it's a wonderful dystopia. I mean, conceptually wonderful, where we end up being the batteries, the electricity generators for the machines. And the machines even take over our minds. They're, infecting our minds with virtual reality, a fool's world, so as to maximize our productivity as batteries and as electricity generators. Or alternative, what is the good story? It is Star Trek, where the replicators and the various technologies are used in order to allow every single person to better themselves, as Captain Picard or Captain Kirk or Captain Janeway or whoever said.
I heard you in a debate recently over whether or not capitalism could be saved. And you were accused of being utopic. And I think that's an accusation that a lot of folks on the left have heard before. How dare you think that Star Trek is a real possibility? It's deeply naive. And I thought your rejoinder was really interesting. You said that the idea that capitalism could be saved, that we aren't already kind of moving past a kind of Adam Smith conception of capitalism, is itself a kind of utopic worldview. Can you explain what you meant by that?
I was harsher than that. I said that the notion of Gillian Tett, who is a wonderful woman that I've debated many times before, her notion that capitalism can be civilized, that is far more utopic than a socialist dream of a post-capitalist democratized economy. And the point I was making was that, all those people who wax lyrical about capitalism, they have in mind a model of capitalism which is as relevant to today's society as Marxism was to the Soviet Union. In other words, not at all relevant. Irrelevant. Absolutely irrelevant. I mean, poor Marx. If he lived in the Soviet Union, he would have ended up in the Gulag, right? And there was nothing in the Soviet Union that resembled his own philosophy, morality, and so on. Similarly, this airy-fairy view of capitalism as markets performing miracles on behalf of people whose activities it coordinates so that their greed ends up serving the public interest. This is all gone. This is finished. The front porch community of their dreams doesn't exist anymore. Adam Smith, the patron saint of the free marketeers, who wrote famously The Wealth of Nations, and before that, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, who was celebrating the market as a place in which the baker, the brewer, and the butcher would, in order to serve their own interest, in the end end up serving the interests of their community, of their village, of their town, by providing good ale, good meat, good bread. That's gone. Now it's Starbucks, it's Facebook, it's Google. These monoliths, megaliths, are nothing like the baker, the brewer, and the butcher. They've simply taken over markets. They've even eliminated them. Amazon has eliminated markets. Amazon is not a marketplace. Amazon is a fiefdom. You enter Amazon, you exit capitalism. You exit the world that we live in.
Can you explain that a little bit? Because, it's literally, they certainly call it the Amazon marketplace. What differs? How does being within that kind of closed system reflect a meaningful departure from capitalism as we typically conceive of it?
Okay, take a farmer's market. You walk into the farmer's market. Okay, there are certain rules, and there's a space, and there are producers and there are consumers. Mm-hmm. But nobody mediates between producers and consumers. You go to the farmer's market, you talk to, the person running one stall, then you go to another one, you look at the tomatoes, you look at the potatoes, you look at, the cauliflower, and, you buy what you want. Nobody controls you, what you look at, what you don't look at. Nobody controls who is selling what, right? The moment you enter into Amazon, you enter a space, a kind of digital city, in which every single item for sale is controlled by one algorithm that belongs to one man, Jeff Bezos. Everything you see has to be approved. The fact that you're seeing it has to be approved by the algorithm that belongs to one man. If Amazon doesn't want you to look at book X or record Y or whatever, a screwdriver, you are never going to see it because the algorithm will make sure that you are never going to see it. Imagine, a market town where one person controls every commodity on sale and also controls what your eyes can see. That is not a market. That is a fiefdom. It is a dystopic fiefdom. It's a digital fiefdom. This is why I'm saying that we don't even have capitalism anymore. We have something that I call techno-feudalism, which is, I need to write a book about this. It will probably be my next book.
The character is definitely obviously different. The degree of control that can be exerted in a digital marketplace is obviously dramatically different.
It's not a digital market. Don't call it a market. It is not a market. It's a fiefdom. It is a system of distributing goods and services that is controlled by one man. That's not a market. The market is by definition, think of economics 101 everywhere in the world. It's a decentralized system. Amazon is the most centralized system. It's more centralized than the Soviet Union was.
I guess what I'm thinking about is the degree to which there have always been constrained choices in various kinds of real world marketplaces as well. Choices to stock certain products on. So it's
But do you know singular any market before Amazon where every single item was controlled by one man? I can't think of one.
No, but I do reflect on
Walmart. You walk into Walmart, there is a lot less control in Walmart than there is in Amazon.
Well, certainly, and that's kind of like the degree point. But there is also, I feel like, an extent to which the level of control is obscured in other kinds of contexts. So not just the way that shelves are stocked, the choice of certain companies to buy certain products, to pick up certain lines of products and run them in their stores. The fact that lack of antitrust regulation has meant that there's very few companies that are making all the products in the world. And this isn't an argument against the severity of Amazon or the departure from traditional marketplaces, but just a suggestion that perhaps Amazon is just the newest manifestation of a trend that's been ongoing because of antitrust issues and other things.
What you're describing is monopoly capitalism, which of course is very different to Adam Smith's competitive capitalism. There's no doubt that capitalism has morphed and transformed itself. It's gone through a number of Ovidian transformations, and it looked very, very different. So, yeah, Wall Street is very, very different to the farmers market. And, back at the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century, Thomas Edison's corporation was very, very different to anything that existed before that. And what you're describing is the power of monopolies or oligopolies. That, however, those monopolies, oligopolies, Walmart, Thomas Edison, and so on, worked within a market. They might have had monopoly power over you as a consumer in the sense that they decided which lines of product to carry, how to display them in their shops, and so on, right? But they didn't control what you could see. They did not control. In Amazon, they control not only what is on display, not only the price of everything which is on display, and that is not just in one store, but across Amazon.com, which is effectively a multi-sector enterprise. But they also control what you can see. Imagine walking into Walmart with a friend, and your friend being able to see completely different things than you, and you not being able to see what your friend sees, and the algorithm deciding what you would see and what your friend would see. And if Walmart did that, then yes, it would be a fiefdom as well. We would have moved beyond monopoly capitalism.
So your argument in the course of that debate, at least, seemed to be that we're so far gone down that road that there's no pulling us back from the brink. And I'm curious what you see as an alternative future that the left should be fighting for in this moment, in this kind of post-Bernie world where a lot of the faith that traditional political movements could help right the ship has been dampened. I mean, your newest book explores various visions of a different kind of future using three characters to kind of moot what that could look like. What kind of conclusions did you come to about what the left should be focused on in this moment?
Well, you're asking the pertinent question, the one I've been trying to escape, to not answer all my life, until at some point I realized that I can't continue to be silent on this because, let's face it, as a left-winger, as a radical, all my life, quite rightly, my political opponents who were supportive of the establishment would say, okay, mate, you don't like capitalism, you don't like the system we have, what's the alternative? It can't be the Soviet model because we know that failed and we wouldn't want to live under it. Of course, there were interesting lessons to be learned from it, but that's another matter. Social democracy is dead. The New Deal has gone. It died on the 15th of August 1971 when Richard Nixon effectively ended Bretton Woods and unleashed financialization. So what's the alternative? So that's why I sat down and wrote that book, Another Now. In it, it's a complicated book. As if you've had a look at it, you will know. So I can't sum it up in very effectively, except to say that the question I'm trying to answer is, can we have a market system with a democratized economy, without an overbearing state, with hardly a state at all, with collective decision-making and collective institutions, but hardly a state at all? I do not want to replace the power of Bezos and Walmart with the power of the state. In that sense, I'm a bit of an anarcho-syndicalist. Could we have a functioning, technologically advanced economy, which is fully democratized, with markets, but without capitalism and without techno-feudalism? And key elements of my answer concern ownership of corporations. I'm promoting in the book the idea of what I call corpo-syndicalism, my version of anarcho-syndicalism, a combination of corporations and syndicalism, based on the idea of a very simple but very radical change in corporate law, where every employee of any company, independently of their rank or position in the company, owns one share and therefore has one vote in the General Assembly of the shareholders of the company, and these shares cannot be traded. They're like library cards in a college. When you enroll at college, you get a library card. You can do things with it. You can log on the computer system, you can borrow books, you can vote in students' elections, and you have access to the place, but you cannot lease it, you cannot rent it, you cannot buy it, and you cannot sell it. Imagine if we lived in a world where corporations operate on the basis of one employee, one share, one vote. What would that do? And the second dimension is a central bank, like the Fed in the United States, the European Central Bank here in Europe, the Bank of England in the United Kingdom, that gives all of us a digital bank account, which means that we no longer have to have a bank account with a commercial bank. So if you take out of today's equation tradable shares and the need to have a bank account in order to effect payments, what do you end up with? You end up with a hugely democratized, market liberal economy.
In my experience, when people propose various worker ownership schemes, the response, and I think this is very telling, the response is a kind of disbelief that workers could ever run a company efficiently, effectively. There's a great degree of pessimism about the ability of anybody other than kind of corporate elites to effectively run the world, regardless of how inefficiently and poorly they've run the world to this point. And it does sometimes feel like the biggest gap between conservatives and progressives, or neoliberals and progressives, or leftists, is how much confidence they have in kind of human nature and their ability to imagine that a world where the interests of workers and companies aligned, as opposed to the interests of shareholders and CEOs and companies aligned, would actually inure to the benefit of the general population.
Right. But remember, workers run companies. Not just blue-collar workers, but companies are run by workers, by white-collar workers, blue-collar workers. It is not BlackRock or State Street or Vanguard that own 90% of companies listed in the New York Stock Exchange. They're not running them. They're running them to the ground. They're doing damage to them. Private equities, the corporate power is detrimental to the interests of corporations. Corporations that are functioning because of people who work in them. But you're quite right. It is the ideological dominance of the narrative that you can't trust the plebs to run stuff. But remember, that was the number one argument against democracy. The number one argument against democracy is you cannot trust the demons to run itself. It's a mob. The idea of one person, one vote. Think about it, it's a very radical idea. It's a hugely radical idea. That's why Republicans don't like it very much.
So they certainly don't.
The idea that whether you are clever, stupid, white, black, man, woman, superbly educated, or an ignoramus who can hardly read and write, that you have one vote. This is such a radical, beautiful idea. But, imagine now, after all those centuries of trying to impose this through democratic struggles, imagine if somebody were to promote the idea that votes should be tradable, that we should be able to sell our votes. It would be an outrage amongst even Republicans. Well, why do we accept the idea that our great corporations are based on the principle that the more money you have, the more votes you can buy in their general shareholder meetings?
Right. Well, I mean, it does. I confront this head on, and I'm interested in this kind of values-based root of, I think, this disagreement, because it comes up again and again. I was recently in conversation with Andrew Sullivan on his podcast, and we were talking about this idea of automation, and how in the past, there was the belief that technology was going to free us up in the ways that you described at the top of this episode. But as that is increasingly possible, as we don't need someone to sit around banging a brick into smaller pieces ad nauseum because there's machines to do it, there is a moral panic based in the belief that if people aren't toiling, and if they're not toiling for 8 hours a day, if all of their time isn't consumed by work, that they will be a drain on society, that there will be negative social consequences, that human value can only be estimated by their ability to work. As opposed to the Star Trek universe that I'm always bringing up that says, look, most people aren't really doing work in a traditional way that we think of. The people who are in Starfleet, which is an exploratory mission, a science mission, are things like chefs and novelists, and people are doing work that's kind of fulfilling and the kind of things that can't be automated, that no machine can do because they're creative and interpersonal. And when I was going back and forth with Andrew Sullivan, it became very, very clear that we just had a very different perspective on human nature and what would come of people, what would come out of people if they weren't kind of tasked in really laborious ways. And I wonder, whether you think that's just kind of an ethical or like a values-based fight that we just have to keep fighting and winning, or what approach you think the left should be taking in a moment like this, where, in your view, capitalism is basically a done deal. It's has, carried the seeds of its own destruction. It's on its way out, regardless of what we do. But we don't really know what the next step is going to be. And, you've argued that it's a little hubristic to think that we could predict it.
Well, you spoke so beautifully that you've already answered your own question. But there's one part of your question that needs to be answered further. So you've given me an opening. I agree, by the way, entirely with what you said. What should the left do? We should abandon laborism, the celebration of labor. Hannah Arendt, who is one of my favorite writers, makes the very important distinction between work and labor. Toiling, labor, is something that we don't want. We don't need it. And there is such hypocrisy amongst the powers that be, because they celebrate automation too. They would say, yes, if we can have a machine, a robot doing all the chores that nobody wants to do, let's have the robot do it. But nevertheless, they still want a society in which, and trade unions and the left falls prey to that, in which everybody is fully employed and the work, the butts off, on a 12-hour basis every day. Why? Why do we want that? I don't want this for my daughter. I do not want my daughter, to lose her opportunity to be creative by toiling, by laboring in order to make ends meet, to put food on the table. Who wants this for their kids? But remember, since you spoke of Star Trek, you're giving me the cue. I don't remember the title of that episode, but there's this episode in the first season of The Next Generation where Enterprise D, comes across that ancient spaceship that contains cryogenically frozen rich people from the 20th century. And they are unfrozen. And one of them is a businessman, of course, who wants to speak to his lawyer in Wall Street. And Picard says to him, look, this is all gone. It's finished. There's no such thing as money anymore. And the guy is startled and says, so what do you do if there's no money making to make, to pursue? And he said, don't worry. These are early diseases that humanity has managed to shake off. And the accumulation of things doesn't matter to us anymore. And the businessman, the unfrozen businessman, very cleverly says to him, but you don't understand. It was never about money. It was about power. And that's what it is about. The powers that be want the hoi polloi to be laboring away, because that is how they exercise power over them, through making them, putting them in a situation where they have very few options but work until the cows come home, on the one hand, and by indebting them, because debt is power over the indebted many. Student loans, payday checks, and so on and so forth. It's all about this greed, which is, of course, detrimental to the mental health even of the powerful. And this is the beauty of Star Trek, because, Picard turns around and says, I'll tell you what we do. We try to better ourselves at an individual and a collective level. In other words, to be artists, to be musicians, to be philosophers. So if technology can allow us to do that, I come from a country that is celebrated around the world because of our invention, more or less, of philosophy, of the ancient Athenian agora. Well, what was the agora? The agora was a marketplace, very little market activity going on. There were, white privileged men sitting around talking philosophy. Why could they do that? Because the women were inside the house looking after domestic labor, and the slaves were tilling the fields and producing agricultural goods. But nevertheless, the fact that they could be in the agora and better themselves and have the Platonic dialogues and so on produced a lot of philosophy. Well, if now we have robots or replicator machines in Star Trek parlance, doing all that work for us. Why can't we work without laboring?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question is a good one. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people have such a negative view of humanity that they don't believe that anything good can come absent that pressure, absent the need to put food on the table, as you say, the threat of being homeless. Folks like conservatives over and over again, when I talk to them, they'll say, yeah, wouldn't it be nice if X, Y, and Z could be in the world? Wouldn't it be nice if we could all have rainbows and butterflies? But at the end of the day, if people won't work, if people don't toil, then they'll sink to their lowest impulses. And you see that in the course of the conversation around these infrastructure bills, right?
Well, they don't think this about their own children. Why do they create trust funds for their kids?
Right. And yet we see work requirements being attached to child tax credits in a country that has the worst protections for children of any similarly industrialized country. And this is the place we're in right now. I wonder if you have any thoughts as we wrap up about these ongoing infrastructure negotiations. I know a lot of people on the left here in the States are very frustrated that there hasn't been a firmer stance taken by elected progressives. You're someone who's shown a great deal of political courage in your own life. And I wonder what you make of the debate going on right now over what was likely to be the biggest bill that Biden is going to be able to pass in the course of his administration.
Well, the moment the election results came out with the Senate split 50-50, with Kamala Harris having the casting vote, it was clear that the New Deal that Biden was promising was going to be toast. Because there were always going to be Democrats, conservative Democrats, that would undermine it. And this is precisely what is going on. I was very pleasantly surprised that Biden was pushing for it. But then again, I have cynical friends, more cynical than me, who claim that, well, there was no skin off his nose because he knew it wouldn't pass. So that's how he could, keep the left wing on side without giving the left wing in the end a new deal. But allow me to say that the writing was on the wall for a simple reason. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, changed America and made a very significant contribution to the world with his New Deal, because his New Deal comprised two components. One component was the works program and the massive investment in creating jobs, building up infrastructure and all that. But there was a second component, which was always absent in the Joe Biden agenda. And that is putting the financial genie back into its bottle, imprisoning the financial genie. Joe Biden was never going to do that. So there are two shows in town. Let's say town being Washington, D.C. at the moment. One is this whole kerfuffle about the infrastructure bill. But there's another show that's happening in silence, and that is the Federal Reserve printing mountain ranges of money, giving it to the commercial banks, which then pass it on to the corporations, which then do not invest it, but instead take it back to Wall Street and buy back their own shares. And this is why Wall Street is doing fantastically well, whereas no infrastructure, no green transition is truly being funded in the United States. And Biden never aimed, as he should have done, at finding a way of preventing all these trillions of dollars that the Fed is printing, or has been printing, from ending up in the pockets of the 1% of the 1%.
And there's very little, I think, activist appetite or, kind of journalistic appetite for pressing on that point at all. I think that the level of discourse around the economic status quo in this country and the extent to which the CARES package last year was the largest upward transfer of wealth in American history. I mean, there's no discussion of it whatsoever. And there's a great degree of, I think, cultural illiteracy, in part because journalists just don't have an appetite to inform on that metric. I'd love to have a whole hour with you to help unpack that for us, because I confess to also be pretty limited in my ability to discuss economics with any fluency. But I did want to just ask you one last thing, since I know we have limited time. You've described yourself as a kind of a libertarian socialist, if I'm correct. And I don't know if you've caught some of these recent remarks by Noam Chomsky that had him trending on Twitter earlier this week, where he has come down very strong on vaccine mandates. And I wonder what you make of this ongoing debate and this balance between kind of civil liberties and an investment in getting the COVID pandemic under control, and it playing out around someone like Noam Chomsky, who is heralded as a kind of a civil libertarian, but in this moment, in this context, and perhaps at this age, seeming to turn his back on some of his longer held principles.
Well, I have to say that Noam is a great friend of mine. I haven't had the chance to discuss this with him, so I will not comment much on it because I really don't know what he said on this. But I'll tell you what my position has been on this. I'm a very strong pro-vaccination advocate. I lead a political party here in Greece, and our party is like this about vaccinations. But at the same time, I very much fear that those of us who are supporting the vaccination drive are shooting ourselves in the foot. When we become anti-vaxxers, when we become prone to demonizing those who are skeptical of the vaccines. I personally think that it is irrational to fear vaccines, but at the same time, there's so little trust in government and in big pharma that when somebody comes to me people walk up to me on the street and they say, "What should I get vaccinated? Should I vaccinate my children? Should I vaccinate my wife, my husband, whatever?" And I say, "Yes, do it." But I try to talk to them with respect for their fear. People have good reason to fear authority, and of course, Noam Chomsky knows this better than anyone else. And when you deal with this fear, you've got to do it respectfully. You must never demonize. You must never treat them like Hillary Clinton treated Trump supporters by calling them deplorable. You must speak to them, talk to them with facts, with statistics, open their eyes. So you need an education campaign. Using surveillance and using authoritarianism is both wrong morally and absolutely ineffectual. In the end, all you're managing to do is you're managing to strengthen the anti-vax feeling of those who are not crazies, but who are simply slightly worried about everything that they hear.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And with that, I'll let you go. Thank you for spending this time with us. Rapid fire, what's your favorite Star Trek series?
Voyager.
Oh, that's an interesting take. You have, I think that AOC said the same thing, and I have thoughts, but we'll have to have you back to debate that. We could go for an hour on just that alone.
Maybe next time we speak, then I will come up with DS9 or something else. Okay. By the way, I never stop watching Star Trek. I watch one episode every day.
Do you really?
One episode every day all my life.
Where are you now? In the cycle?
A small island off the coast of Athens.
No, I mean, where are you in the cycle of watching Star Trek? What series or what season?
I'm now back at the next generation, which I haven't watched for at least a year.
Okay.
So I need to do some catching up.
I just restarted Deep Space Nine again, so I'm feeling very strongly that the correct answer to that question is DS9. But that's a fight for another day.
I defer to you because I love DS9. I remember, for instance, that episode in which the Cardassian war criminal or somebody, the clerk who pretends to be the leader of the concentration camp. The episode I'm talking about. That's so dear to my heart. Anyway.
Yep.
DS9.
Okay.
Long live DS9.
Long live DS9. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a real treat.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.